Welcome to the last of the mini lectures, mini lecture number 12 in 7505 NSC Project Management. In the previous mini lectures, we've looked at all of the aspects of actually conducting a project and managing it. And in fact, what we've done is we've used material from the chapters of the set textbook Pinto right throughout. In the last of the mini lectures, what we're looking at now are complex projects, and particularly projects that occur in the aerospace and defence industry. And so, in fact, we're looking beyond Pinto as far as this is concerned. We're going to take a look at tendering for projects, which are projects within themselves. We're going to be looking at contracts management for these projects and contracts negotiations. We spoke about negotiation earlier, but we're talking about that negotiations on specific complex aerospace and defence projects, and we'll be using case studies throughout. So in this one, we're going to be, first of all, describing the source solicitation process used by industry and government for traditional and complex projects. That is, to actually get to do a project, you've got to actually go out and win it. And that in itself is a project that often takes a number of years to go through. We're going to describe the characteristics of complex projects and how their management differs from traditional projects. We're going to be describing different technology levels in the lecture itself, but we won't be talking about it in this mini lecture, but we'll talk about the impact of technology in projects themselves. We're going to explain how traditional project management techniques are applied across the three stages of a complex project, and we're going to describe the typical source selection process that might be used by government anywhere in the world on complex projects, and explain the various contractual issues and how they impact projects in the negotiation for contract awards. One of the major references we'll use throughout this is different references, but particularly the Integrated Project Management Handbook produced by the United States Department of Defence. The one thing that we realise is that the United States is very, very open in their project management procedures for defence projects themselves. And we know that these procedures are very much mirrored in the aerospace industry, but also they're used by governments around the world. And so by understanding the project management procedures here, we get an understanding of the other techniques that might be used that could have originated from the US DoD. First of all, we talk about the major types of business solicitation, and we talk about their differences. We talk about the invitation to register interest, or the ITR. And this is often used by companies to put out feelers to say, look, this is a product that we're going to be needing in the future, and we want to find out as to who's interested and who's got the capabilities. The next thing we get is a request for proposal and the request for tender. Now, these are used interchangeably amongst different countries. But we'll be seeing as to, for example, in Australia, the request for proposal is a basic tender response, but it doesn't go into the same detail as a request for tender. But we'll find out as to how these are used and just what they entail. The last, of course, we'd look at is the request for quote. And this is something that's used as part of a project for deciding whereabouts, if we have to buy specific subsystems, who can we go to and how do we actually get a price from them. So these are important for understanding some of the tools that are used to win projects and also do business within projects themselves. As an illustration, I always show how solicitations have changed. And for example, when the US Army Signal Corps decided to purchase an aircraft, it issued a one-page request for proposal. Following a 40-day competition amongst 41 bidders, the Wright brothers had their example, which was accepted. And the resulting fixed-price contract incentive clause was only 2 pages long. Now, projects today, for example, the tender requests that come out can go for thousands of pages. The contracts themselves may go for hundreds and hundreds of pages. And so it's interesting to reflect and see as to how much has changed across the years. If we look at the integrated project management approach used between government and industry, because we know in the defence industry governments are the purchasers, and industry provides the products. And what we look at is we see that government and industry very often work closely hand in hand. As we said earlier in our course, very often the customer is not well educated about what they want, and sometimes the industry themselves aren't educated, but they often pool resources to help come up with a clear idea. So program definition is very, very important, and this inquires that developing the different requirements, the risks and the strategy. Industry does the market research and also works with government. Often industry will comment on the draft requirements that government have put out. Industry will often look at the risks and the strategies. Then we get into the execution and planning side, and this requires, first of all, going through the RFP process, as the United States talks about. In Australia, it's the request for tender process. But basically, once we get a request for proposal out, and very often the government can come up with a draft, put it out to industry, comment on it, make changes, and then issue it, and then we get someone who is awarded the tender. And very often, during the execution planning, the successful tenderer will find, hey, there are a few things here that don't look right, and so they'll go back to the government for clarification. So the big key is to work together, very much in collaboration. What we find is that final source selection is made, and this is where we get down to the tin tacks. This is where we get into the contract negotiations once the successful tender is required, and we get into the program execution phase. So this diagram gives a simple idea as to the process that we go through. We've spoken about complex projects. So what's the difference between a complex project and a traditional project? Well, complex projects are characterised by a degree of disorder, disability, emergence. By that we mean emergence of new problems never seen before, new technologies, non-linearity, that is, things don't behave as we expected, uncertainty and randomness. And the one thing that we find is that complex projects often have very complex technologies. They often have a lot of political focus in them, and also there can be cultural aspects come into them at all. So what we know about complex projects compared to traditional projects is a greater degree of uncertainty. And so if we look at this graph here as to what objectives are to be achieved and how to implement them, what we find is that if we look at clarity versus unclear, we find complex projects are in that unclear area as to the objectives to be achieved, and also the how is also going to be difficult. So projects such as the Boeing 787 would be considered a complex project, but the Joint Strike Fighter is even more complex because it's not just complex in being the aeroplane it is, but all the onboard systems with all the software that they entail. Here we see a project of the overall process of industry and government working together, and here we can see the three stages we were talking about before: the program definition, the actual execution, planning itself, and then the program execution itself. And here we'll be talking through the different stages that go through, such as the statement of objectives, the actual acquisition strategy that's worked out, the actual draft and that request for proposal or request for tender. People go back and clarify that, and they come up with the actual final request for proposal. People then put in their tenders themselves, the tender award comes out, and we can see that the government process is defined at one level, but industry also goes through its process. First of all, deciding, are we going to bid for this work or not? If we're going to bid for it, how do we structure the program? What will our solution look like, and how will this look like in the draft proposal? And we look at these different colour review teams. These are the review teams that sit back and at different stages say, should we be continuing ahead? What does our draft tender look like? What does the final tender look like? So we'll be going through this program such that you will understand every part of it and how it relates to your particular countries in the sorts of complex acquisitions that they may be doing. If we get the strategic selector by the contractor, this is the important part. First of all, contractors have to decide what's the market we're going to compete in. Then out of that market, what's the pool of possible project opportunities we will look at, and then say, well, we can't afford to bid for them all. Let's get a short list down and let's work out what's the probability that the tender will still go ahead, because we don't want to invest too much money chasing down something that may never go to tender, and what's our probability of winning. And then taking a look at, well, how do we get selected to get to be part of this actual competition? Now we come to the source selection, and source selection is very, very important. As we've seen, for example, if a customer, as we saw in Australia, picks a certain solution, such as the Sea Sprite helicopter, they can spend a lot of money and find out we didn't go really through a good selection process. We picked the wrong company to provide. So every country and every government generally has its own source selection authority. What we have to do is take a look at and say, what is the aim that we're after? That is, what is this actual project going to satisfy, and how does the different tenderers provide a possible solution? So to make sure that they get the best result, they've got to have a source selection authority set up well in advance, so that they have the right people, those people are trained with the right skills. And in picking something such as, will I pick a Boeing 787 for my airline versus an Airbus 350? Will I pick a Joint Strike Fighter for my Defence Force versus a Eurofighter? That takes a lot of knowledge, and so people have to be there who actually know as to what to look for to make the best source selection, and to then incorporate that into a source selection plan. So here we're finding that these projects demand a lot more than what we're normally used to. We then get to the contract negotiation process, and this is important because when companies sign up to a contract that they shouldn't have perhaps signed, that's when problems arise. And we will have discussed a lot of examples through the course where when we come to this, we'll be able to draw on those examples. And the big thing is, for both sides, they have to know the contract to be negotiated. And as in that negotiations, the customer will be after the best deal, but the contractor will be after the best deal. And so they have to be able to go through and look at the contract in detail and understand it to get the best outcome. They've got to have a contract negotiation strategy, so both end up with a result that they're happy with, and making sure that the contract negotiation team on both sides have got all the right skills to be able to identify the potential problems and to make sure that these are sorted out well before the contract is finally signed. And of course, the important thing is that the records are kept exact and accurate right throughout, so that when the final contract is drawn up, any changes made are going to be immediately identified through a clear audit trail. What are just some of the contract terms and conditions that people have to sign up to that really need to be understood? Well, first of all, there's intellectual property. For example, if you actually build a product and you think you've got a lead over competitors and you give that to a customer, you don't want the customer passing out details of your intellectual property. At the same time, the customer doesn't want to buy a particular product and suddenly find that you've gone out of business and you're no longer there to support it. How are they going to support it? So intellectual property is a particular field in itself. Then we have removal of personnel. For example, a contract may say, these are the personnel we're going to put up to execute the contract. But the customer says, but I know some of those people and I don't think they're your best people. So how do they actually go about deciding as to who stays on the project team and who doesn't? Then we get indemnity, and this is protecting the customer's employees against specific costs. For example, you might be installing a particular system at a customer location, and one of your employees may accidentally set fire to a building and that building's burnt down. Who's responsible for that? The customer or the contractor? So these have to be cleared up before. Insurance and liability. Do people have the particular insurances required? And who is going to be held liable in a case. And that particular early example is the same. Export licenses, that is, particular technology may be very, very sensitive. Who's got the right to be able to share that technology around? And we'll look at different cases of where this has occurred. In summary, therefore, what we find is that this is a very, very applied part of project management. And this takes it from the theory that is set out in the textbook to showing the more practical and advanced theories that are used in the real world of aerospace and defence particularly. We're going to be describing the source solicitation process that's used by industry and governments, and of course this can even be taken to situations for airlines. We're going to describe the characteristics of complex projects and how they differ from traditional projects. We're going to be talking about technologies and how they can affect the project itself and understanding their impact on very, very complex projects. We're going to talk about how traditional project management techniques are applied across the three major project stages and describe a typical source selection process in understanding what it is that both sides have to do to make sure that the source selection ends up with the best person getting the job done. And we're going to explain the various contractual issues. Knowing the contract, things that we do in this you will find important even in your own private lives, because when you buy a house you sign up for a contract, and many of the concepts we talk about here can be applicable to even buying something as simple as a house. This is a lecture that's very, very applied and using very, very practical case studies right throughout. Thank you.